Hello, welcome to Aural Hygiene. It's the podcast where we look at caught films, experimental films, educational films, and the like. This is Matt here. I'm actually bringing in the first guest for a little while to this podcast because it just tickles several of my funny bones. We're looking at Disney's Fantasia today, as mainstream as you can get in a way, but in Disney World, like not the place, but the concept, it's kind of a caught film, and it's definitely a caught film. So joining us today is Thomas Gorence. He's been making comics about conspiracies and such as a paranoid American, and also spent a decade in the fishbowl at Hollywood Studios at Disney World, if I'm correct.
That's right.
Yeah. So how did that start? And you said you were working on some of the post ride materials primarily.
So first of all, thanks for having me on, man. I'm looking forward to chatting up all kinds of cool topics that might be new to you and some of your listeners. My journey on how I got to Disney is a very winding one. I started in the military as a computer programmer and got out, and then immediately was a professional musician for 2 or 3 years, and started, playing the actual world of like touring and producing for large artists and everything, and hated every moment of it. It was like my dream come true. And then after a year, it was like, oh, this is how this works. So I went in the complete opposite direction. I went back to school in Orlando for animation and game programming and just a whole bunch of like digital art stuff, kind of combining, music and my background in programming. And straight out of school, I got a job at Disney on, Hollywood Studios at the time. And like you said, it was in the little fishbowl, although at that time they had already tinted out the windows. And that little backlot tour was, I don't think anything that anyone went on anymore. The coolest thing back there is they had like stunt drivers that were practicing for like the stunt show that was out in the park and a couple other things. But it was technically the Roy O. Disney building in the backlot of Hollywood Studios, which has since been demolished. And I think it's been replaced by Star Wars rides.
Now I remember taking that tour twice when I was a teenager, and once, yeah, seeing because they would show you whatever movie was being produced at the time. So I distinctly remember one time it being Pocahontas, and the other time being the I don't El Dorado, or it's the one that eventually became The Emperor's New Groove, but it was at the stage where it was still going to be the more serious movie.
You might
When
have
I
been
saw
one
it.
of the very last people to take that tour before they started blacking out the windows. That must have happened at the very, very end of the 90s, or maybe like the very beginning of 2000s, because I started working there around 2005, I think.
Yeah, this would have been 2001, I think, or maybe 2000, but yeah. So interesting stuff there. But oh, I lost my train of thought there.
Oh, you were asking me what I did there
Yes,
too.
yes, yes.
So first and foremost, I'm not an illustrator or a drawer. I basically do stick figures, but a lot of my job when I was there involved all sorts of art direction. So like one of the examples I was giving you is that if you go to Epcot at Orlando, they've got that big Epcot ball, and inside that is Planet Earth, Spaceship Earth, I think it's called. I forgot the name of it. But you go on this like slow ride, and it starts in like the caveman age, and you just kind of slowly go around, and you see like Steve Jobs inventing a computer at one point, and medieval people discovering things. And when it kicks you out, there's all these interactive games and exhibits and stuff. So I worked on a lot of those sort of interactives. And then also there's a VIP center upstairs that most people don't know about in the Epcot. So there's like a little secret entrance, and we did a lot of the interactive stuff for that upstairs stuff. And then got to work on all sorts of really cool games and projects using Disney IP, doing 3D animation, 2D animation. So pretty much the full gamut, other than putting my pencil in my hand and drawing something on paper.
Yeah, like I mentioned to you in one of the emails running up that one of my weirdest childhood memories is Spaceship Earth breaking down, I think somewhere around the printing press. And us having to walk backwards through the entire ride with all the show lights are on, and it was just pretty trippy.
It's a little bit weird when the lights come on. Yeah.
Yeah. and just walking, because the way it's built, I guess there aren't actually back passages. You just have to walk through the ride itself.
Yeah.
Because it spirals
It's
all the way
not
up and
meant
down.
for you to get out and walk around on your own, for sure.
um and I guess let's talk just a little bit about Disney and how you're drawing the lines together. You mentioned, I think it's, if I'm pronouncing it right, the De Monet Society.
Demolay, yeah.
Demolay, okay, because yeah, I grew up. I was in the Boy Scouts as an Eagle Scout even, and when I heard about that, I was like, well, we have this Order of the Arrow thing in the Boy Scouts, which I guess is kind of like a similar vibe to that. Just the Boy Scout secret society, and this sounds like something a little bit similar.
Yeah, so instead of like a secret club within Boy Scouts, this is almost like a Boy Scout society within Freemasonry, although it's really hard to characterize it like that. It's more adjacent to Freemasonry. So for example, just because a kid might be in Demolay doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to become a Freemason, but it does mean that your equivalent of like the Cub Scout master, that's going to be a Freemason. So everyone that's like in charge within Demolay are Masons, but they're just kind of like raising kids, and it has some weird connotations to it, but it harkens back to like the mid 50s or something. So for example, instead of your Cub Master, do you remember what you used to call them? Was there like a certain name? You just call them like leader, or Cub Scout Master or something, Scout Master?
For Cub Scouts, I don't quite. Oh, Cub Scouts, it's pack leader, and the Boy Scouts, it's Scout Master, and then or din mother if it's a woman in the Cub Scouts.
Okay, so in Demolay, it's mommy and daddy, depending on gender. So your Scout Master, your Cub Scout Master, whatever, that's daddy, or just dad. And then, any female authority type is just mom. So that's one of and the reason why I even bring that up is because Walt Disney himself kind of had a sordid past with his dad, to the point where he kind of denied his lineage. He thought that he was adopted by some kind of nobility in Spain, and there was this Disney-esque story of a kid being kidnapped by like the evil parents and kept away from the castle that he rightfully belonged in. But so he kind of had this lifelong issue with his dad, and here comes this Demolay group, this quasi Masonic adjacent group, and the guy that actually founded this in the 50s, that was his Cub Scout master. He wasn't just part of some branch out somewhere. He actually was part of one of these original classes. I think it was in Kansas City. So to be under the wing of this guy that you're calling dad when you hate your own dad, and is legitimately giving you some kind of structure and foundation, it's very hard to understate how much of an impact this had on Walt Disney's life and every single thing that came after that. He said as much anytime it came up.
No, I mean, that's a major part of one's life at the time. And even for me, I'm thinking some of the things that really like shaped my personality are like really small things, not even like a society or an organization. So that could be that much more, like I just remember like an interaction with a kid when I was growing up, like it was like our parents just wanted to get us out of the way and have us play together. And I was like, oh, I want to play. And the kid didn't want to, right? So I'm like, that's still kind of like, maybe that's one of the reasons I podcast, to like get over it, dragging people in to do things and actually enjoying it. So, but it's a little thing. Yep. So something like
group
that,
catharsis,
yeah, something like that's going to, of course, inform one's personality way more than just a single incident, and that can be very powerful as well.
So I mean that's a significant factor, and it ties into this bigger arcing theme of that a lot of the original source material from Disney has all sorts of folklore and occult magical meanings, and it's not just pure coincidence. It's because a lot of this fit into the same framework that not just Walt Disney, but a lot of the people that he worked with and hired, they were all very much in the same frequency almost. So to draw a point to the reason why Demolay is so important, he actually didn't become, as far as I'm aware, Walt Disney never became a Freemason. So you'll see all sorts of conspiracy theories online. He was a 33rd degree Mason, or he was a, this and that. From what I can understand, he just was in Demolay and used it to kind of like help guide his maturing through, the Hollywood and just becoming a man, but he never actually went back and became a Freemason or did much with Demole aside from go and accept their awards and write nice things about them whenever it came up.
It is interesting because, of course, we'll be looking a little more closely at Fantasia in a few minutes as kind of a main thing of those sort of occult things being in a film. And today, it's like, oh, they secretly put this in. You look at the new Doctor Strange, maybe, and oh, I've seen it once, but maybe there's this little thing and this little thing kind of like being shoehorned in. But then I'm thinking, living in Japan, Japanese animation, it's usually very much on the sleeve. Some of the most recent popular Japanese animations have been about 5 years ago is Yokai Watch, which is a little bit like Pokemon, but it's all like kind of folklorish demons that basically everyone knows about. And Kimetsu no Yaiba that's Demon Slayer in the States. That has a lot of that stuff right on the sleeve, and everyone in Japan already knows about it. The 5-year-old already knows about all these kind of disturbing folk tales.
Yeah, and it's not even like thinly veiled. And there was actually a pretty strong point that in the earlier years, so when Disney was first forming, 30s, 40s, these topics were not really that much taboo. If anything, they were sort of the hot topics of the day. You know, it was like the interesting novelties that people might actually be talking about in just common conversation if they thought, you know, themselves as interesting. It's over time, it seems that American culture has become a lot more sort of, I wouldn't say puritanical from a substance point of view, but from like a critical point of view. It has these like still very puritanical criticisms of almost anything that goes on. And it's kind of interesting that out of all of the, I think it's all the countries that have, you know, GDPs, like all of the above average GDPs, and anyone that has 50% or more that identifies heavily religious, the United States is like the only one in that entire category. So if you've got a GDP that's greater than over half the other side of the world, then chances are less than half of your population is strongly religious. For whatever reason, USA is a complete outlier here. And I think that has a lot to do with how there's, you know, claims of like nefarious information being injected into movies by the Illuminati or by the Satanists or by, you know, enter the blank here on whoever's kind of your boogeyman. And that kind of rhetoric takes a much stronger hold in the United States than it does in Europe or Asia or almost anywhere else in the entire planet.
Well, yeah, in Japan, the question, are you religious or are you not religious, barely even makes sense because it's kind of in the background of Japan. Like on New Year's, pretty much everyone's going to go to a shrine. You have a big test. You'll go get the fortune from the temple or whatever. But there's, you know, you find very few people that would be like a fundamentalist, you know, Buddhist or something. That's kind of strange, right?
So. And ironically, if you had some kind of like fundamentalist Buddhist teachings in a Disney movie, that itself could be construed as not necessarily satanic, but as like a cult, or, you know, they're slipping in this non-WASP, non-Protestant programming into our, you know, children's media. Get it out of here. So I think there's some element of that, and that element that goes way back to, you know, Salem witch trials almost. It goes back so deep and so far that it's really hard to extract that out from American culture. But it's also, unless you're completely inundated in American culture, it might not be the easiest thing to understand that even people that consider themselves non-religious, they are heavily influenced by, you know, like religious-based morals and values that are just ingrained in the culture. So all of this adds up to people seeing a Disney movie and thinking there's some kind of, you know, evil conspiracy behind it.
Yeah, I don't think the Japanese really get too heavy-minded on that. The thing living here is there's, you know, all the unwritten social rules that you're just supposed to know. Once you follow those, go think and do what you want, basically. But you need to follow these societal rules, some of which really don't make sense. So but yeah, that's neither
and to be clear too, I'm not talking about like a vast majority of Americans or even a small minority. It's a very tiny niche that gets very vocal on proclaiming, you know, all these nefarious and built-in messages, but they kind of reverberate and echo and last for decades and decades. So you'll hear the exact same claims, you know, the day that Aladdin came out, you're hearing the exact same conspiracy theories now, you know, 2 decades later, 3 decades later.
I mean, I guess one of the big things is looking into that sort of thing can be super fascinating just to leave your sort of emotional stock out of it. Because if I'm just like, how is this going to affect me like directly? Well, it's not, so or like if it is, I can't really do much about it from where I'm standing. So just, do the best you can from your place of power and you know, find the rest of the universe fascinating. So
Yeah, seriously. I mean, no disagreements here for sure.
let's look at the world of Fantasia. If you were to be making the TV guide listing for Fantasia, what would it say?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm used to the actual TV guides from back when, and it was like a sentence maybe. So it was always very interesting to see how they would wrap up, a fairly complicated plot line in just like a tiny little sentence. But I guess it would just be some of world's best orchestra pieces put to some of world's greatest animation all together. Disney,
Okay.
watch now something. But I mean, that's kind of encapsulates my idea of it too. It takes this really beautiful pieces of music that probably were more appreciated at the time then, but you watch it now and it just sounds like old timey, orchestra music. No one appreciates how sort of influential some of these original pieces that got selected are, and then just the quality of animation and even the topic. Like some of the things that you see here, you won't see in Disney cartoons ever again, I don't think. Like dinosaurs dying and turning into bones and sort of like single cell organisms growing up. And the biggest one, which is my favorite, is Chernobog, which you might have like allusions to him, but I think he's like one of Disney's coolest inventions, or at least coolest drawings of a known character. But it's entirely like a Disney invention, the way that they sort of created him.
No, it's one of the most nightmarish images you're going to see, which is kind of interesting for a film you're going to take the family to. I remember, pooping myself as a kid once he shows up. So that
Yeah.
happens.
So was this actually a scary movie to you when you saw it when you were younger?
Well, I guess this segment was, yeah, sure. Of course, parts of it are kind of when you're 4, you don't have the patience for some of it. I mean, I guess that's why we have the dancing hippos to get the kids to wake up a little bit or something. But
I'm curious, were there any other Disney movies outside of Fantasia that you found particularly like scary or frightening?
well, I know I haven't actually seen this one since I was a kid, but yeah, the Black Cauldron. I remember having another demon along these lines. So
I'll have to rewatch that one. I don't think I've seen that in a very long
oh yeah,
time.
yeah, they try and kind of re-up on the Satan in that one a little bit, but if I remember correctly, I'm trying to think what else. Oh, there's the sequence. This is live action, but right at the end of the black hole where Maximilian Schnell ends up in hell or something. That's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, I think Pinocchio is one of the scariest ones for me too. When he gets kidnapped and there's like lightning and he's stuck in this little like carriage and the guy's yelling at him from the driver's seat.
Oh yeah, for that one for sure. Yeah, okay, I should think a little more in the past. It's been about 10 years, 8 or 10 years. My daughter is now 12, so
Mhm.
when she was like 2 to 4, of course we were playing a lot of those
Are there any that
model
you
times.
decided like this one might be a little too much for this age? Like we're waiting until she gets older to show her this Disney cartoon.
This one's not Disney, but I do remember picking up the Blu-ray of Rango, and in the first 5 minutes she was like, I think I need to be older before I watch this.
She might have been right, yeah.
Yeah, she might have been right, but well, I mean, last year she was like, I want to see some horror movies, and at first I tried to keep it like, oh, watch those Addams Family comedies, and we watched The Goonies. She was like, no, I want real horror movies, so we watched The Shining and Alien.
Okay, that's not bad. That's not a
There's
bad intro.
I think there's a yeah, when yeah, when Jack Nicholson goes in the room, whatever it is, in The Shining, I was kind of like, okay, let's hit the skip here. But otherwise we watched The Shining. So
I
but,
recommend too. This might be a weird one, but Dead Alive, which was one
oh
of
god, yeah, Peter
Phil
Jackson.
Jackson's for Peter Jackson. Just because it's got the gore, but it's also done in such like a silly way that it's hard to be scared of it, and it also prepares you for like much crazier gore that comes in movies that take themselves way more seriously after that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I somehow actually managed to see that one in the movie theater. So
Really? I'm a little bit jealous. Yeah.
yeah, it's just well, it was like the college movie theater with so just a shoebox. But hey, it's
Okay.
a movie I can claim to have
Yep.
seen in the theater. So um sorry, I'm just going to my own notes. I kind of want to take a little bit segment by segment. The first one we have the toccata and fugue in D minor. Um, one thing's from a musical perspective, I do a lot of music. I do rock, I do electronic, I do classical, but this is an arrangement of an organ piece, which I don't know if that bears anything. I think Stokowski, the conductor, actually made this arrangement, so maybe he just wanted to push his own arrangement. But it is interesting that this is supposed to be one of those things that's being played on an old church organ in an old cathedral, getting whatever energy and blasting sonic waves through you in that way.
Yeah, and another interesting thing too that I guess is worth mentioning is that, as far as I can tell, it's not like someone sat down before Fantasia started and said, we're going to pick these musical pieces and play them in this order, and they're going to be about these different animations. It was almost like all the different animators kind of broke up into teams and directors and just, went out and picked music and animated to it almost in little bubbles. I'm sure there was communication at some level, but it doesn't seem like anyone actually sat down and said, okay, if you guys are working on these 5 scenes, we're going to do this thing that fits in. So there's a little bit of this like hodgepodge collection, like almost like an anthology feel to this whole entire movie. And there's also all sorts of different variations on order. So I think the original cinematic version of it, they played the clips in slightly different order than you would see on the first major release. And then there's like Fantasia 2000, which inserts all kinds of extra clips. There's also a few that were left out. There's animation that was partially done by Salvador Dali that wasn't finished in time for the film that you can watch kind of outside this. I think it was released on like a DVD extra. But I'm going into this just because the specific songs and the orders um, doesn't seem like they had a whole lot of planning behind it when like they first started out, but all of the arrangement and the collection and the order kind of like happened afterwards. So the story, if any, is sort of laid on top, and it depends on which order you watch the different sequences in on what kind of story that's being told.
Yeah, from what I understand, the original idea was this is when you would still do movies as road shows. So the idea was to be put out Fantasia every few years with different clips taken out and new ones placed in, which is why the Sorcerer's Apprentice is in 2000. I think they kind of wanted to just at least like nod to that concept. But the movie itself wasn't, it wasn't so much it wasn't successful, from what I understand. It was just too expensive. Like you had to have this expensive sound system. The contracts required like just premium projection equipment be used, and they couldn't afford to display it in the end, especially once World War II got really cranking.
Yeah, and well, this was also a great way to take all the profits and all of that prestige and rapport that had been built over their first few movies and use it to invest in just highly experimental new workflows and new artists and incorporating music in new ways. Because I think Disney was one of the first ones that had really strong synchronized audio and full length movie with music and multiple voice actors across the board. Before that, it was very, very limited. So this was his version of pushing the envelope a little bit farther than I guess the media was ready or the customers are ready to kind of consume at that time. But you'll also notice that a lot of the characters that show up in Fantasia make appearances in movies, years and years to come. So it was almost like this being a loss leader of, let's invest all this information and time and money and energy into just developing IP, and they can just use this from like a big pool that they draw from for the next 5 decades essentially.
Yeah, really. Of course, the first sequence we don't get that, but we get the very abstract animation. I was actually a little disappointed with Fantasia 2000 that they use Beethoven's Fifth for that, and it's not quite as abstract. Where here it's just super abstract, which I enjoy. So honestly, and this could be like Disney programming me, man. If you say the word music, if you say the word music, first thing I'm gonna think of visualize is kind of like a pinkish sky with weird swirls. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you too, because if you try to talk about like earbuds, like catchy little tunes, almost every single one that I'm gonna think of is gonna be Disney. It's gonna be It's a Small World, it's gonna be Hi Ho, it's gonna be, something that I heard as a kid, because, and it's probably even worse now because, VHS tapes and DVDs, I guess now, or not even DVDs like Netflix, but this is kind of like the thing that you put on to raise the kid. And I guess before Netflix existed, it was whatever collection of those, Disney VHS cassette tapes that were kind of friendly for all families. So you'd be guaranteed that if you were going over and being babysat, or if you were going to be like hanging out with the kids somewhere where adults had something to do, they were just going to pop in Beauty and the Beast or Little Mermaid for like the 200th time, and you're going to hear all those songs again. So even if it wasn't your favorite song, like you're going to know them all by heart. So that was, I feel like a lot of my almost chord progressions that I just like default back to are probably just coming out of some Disney movies at some points.
No, I had to go back downstairs and dig out the old pink DVD folder for that. So,
And you mentioned too that you've been playing music for what, like 30 years or something.
Yeah.
Because I started, I had to kind of decide if I wanted to keep typing or wanted to keep playing, because it was just too much on my wrist to do both 24/7 nonstop. But I remember almost every really difficult piece, if it wasn't jazz or some, like solfeggio, sort of like classical piece, it was almost always going to be fake music from Disney movies. It was, The Lion King came out, and I was getting all the fake, uh, sheets from the local music store and learning those when I went to go to my lessons. So again, like Disney was like ingrained in my consumption and creation of music for such a long time.
Yeah, that's another thing why I'm kind of like with the Bach at the beginning. I'm a cello player, and I've played the cello suites, and getting in and listening to them is of course one thing, but getting into them is like, there's I think it's the fifth one where the opening you're basically playing a fugue on a cello, which a fugue is, you probably know, but one melody starts and then starts to do its own thing when the other instrument plays the same melody, does its own thing. So you have multiple instruments starting off playing the main theme and then doing their own thing, and now you're doing all of that on a single cello. So it's kind of psychedelic just trying to play that.
And the cello is really interesting too. I don't know if we'll get into this or where I made this note, but there's this concept of divisions of instruments, and the fact that say like a guitar or piano, they have set intervals between the notes. But when you get into like cellos and violins, and some of the other string instruments, you lose that concept of incremental, like you can play, incremental notes, but you also have this concept of like almost infinite possibility. Now, obviously, depending on the size of your finger and the size of the string and the size of the instrument, but in theory, if you had a very large version of any of these string instruments, you kind of have an infinite range of notes and in between notes, and this infinite way of always having the note half half half. And this kind of plays into some of the instruments that are used in the various scenes within Fantasia.
Yeah. Especially on a cello, even if you're Yo-Yo Ma, you're probably not exactly playing the note. It's pretty impossible to actually do that. Especially when you're going way up on the instrument. It's interesting. I only recently learned how to do that, because in orchestras you never need to play that far up on the instrument, but on some solo music you do. And it's weird because I'm like guessing, but I'm still hitting the right notes. So I'm like, how's that even happening? Because I'm like, that can't be right. It is right. Okay, cool.
I mean, you're still just playing with emotion at a certain level, right? It's all just about tension and release, and subverting expectation, and then coming back and fulfilling that expectation through the music. And if your fingers are in the right spaces generally, and you're kind of vibing, it's almost like your fingers know how to evoke those emotions. You're not, the muscle memory almost takes over. If you know where those notes roughly are, then you can kind of like put way more emotion into that, and go over some notes and play a lot more and have a lot more flexibility, I think. And again, to bring it back to the Fantasia aspect, I do believe, I don't have the most granular examples of it, but I believe when they incorporate these instruments into these places, that sort of range of infinite possibility, or at least being able to break outside of defined intervals, is sort of incorporated within the overall story, and maybe some of the animations that they incorporate and synchronize with those pieces.
Well, I'm not even well versed to like sit here and tell you what everything is supposed to be, but in the past, composers did take certain instruments for certain emotional cues. Trombones, for example, were supposed to signify death in symphonic works. So when you hear the trombones come in, until about anything written about before 1875, the composer is like, "This is death coming in." So
I never heard that. That's awesome. That's
yeah.
such a cool detail.
And you would use, you know, oboes for a certain thing. There's actually I don't have the attention span to read books on orchestration, but if you do, there's some composers that have written books where they kind of lay all this out. So
No, it's very hard. It's almost like reading like math theory when you start getting into like music theory. It's essentially math.
but I think for Fantasia, it's that I think that's kind of the most important musical cue. Trombones are death. If you're listening to Beethoven or Schubert, the trombones are death. Mozart, I don't think, has trombones in any of his symphonies, but yeah, it didn't start getting added in until about 1800, and that's what it signified. So I guess that probably comes up in at the end of this as well. So let's move to some of the more, I guess, imagery we can really talk about. And you mentioned the order being different, and I was like, what, the Nutcracker second? So I feel like I definitely saw this at some point when the Nutcracker was not second, but
yeah, and I kind of took some notes, and my notes are based on some of the theoretical orders on if you were to try and make Fantasia make a more cohesive story, what order could you watch it in? So I took my notes based on some of those orders, not necessarily on how the original cinematic or 2000 orders came out. So one of my favorite ones to go into, and I didn't get to go into this one yet on anywhere else. So the Rite of Spring.
oh yeah, we
Which,
can jump to that.
so I mean, we can kind of like gloss over. So the Fantasia originally starts out, and it's kind of got the entire orchestra, just silhouettes of them, and it's like a single color background. There's no animation or anything. And let me tie back to my overarching theory here is whether or not you believe in magic, or whether or not Walt Disney believed in magic. Fantasia could very much, and you were mentioning, you know, all this time that was invested in it, but it wasn't necessarily a huge commercial success. I guess my argument would be that Fantasia was sort of this magical spell, this huge magic spell that out of it gave birth to the Disney universe. Because prior to Fantasia and all the movies that came after it, but you know, Disney could have just been like a one-hit wonder. It could have been like a Max Fleischer animation studio or any other number of animation studios that got really popular and then sort of, you know, fell to the wayside. But after Fantasia, it really took hold. Even if Fantasia itself wasn't that thing that did it, it helped create this whole entire magical ecosystem that allowed every other idea that came afterwards to sort of be nurtured within it. And the occult theme here is that very much so, when you watch this over, you could almost watch this as if it were this magical spell that's being performed, or like a magical ritual. And this is further emphasized. So if you take that very first scene where it starts with individual instruments and silhouettes, you've got black and a single color, and then all of a sudden they start introducing multiple instruments. This is hearkening to this idea of like vibrations and energy that are creating this like genesis of the universe. So it starts with the single tone, almost the monad, and then after this it becomes more and more complex, and this is represented by additional instruments, more complicated colors, you start getting gradients, then all of a sudden some really basic abstract shapes start to form. There's like a lightning strike that goes with some kind of percussive instrument, and then after all of this takes place, it starts shifting into actual animation, and this is where Rite of Spring comes in. So everything prior to Rite of Spring is sort of these silhouettes and non-animation graphics. And I think this kind of represents like, this is God. These are the human beings that are about to create what you're going to see that gets created, and what is getting created is this animated universe.
Okay, so yeah, let's take Rite of Spring as the next stage of the narrative then. At the beginning of clip, they have the percussionists basically like having a clumsy fit, which I thought was interesting watching this time. I was like, why did they put that in there? And
Well, and I think this could be representative of the very first image we see, which represents the Big Bang. So this is, this cacophony, which almost is like the exact definition of all these percussive instruments kind of having a fit. This cacophony is representative of this, absolute chaos explosion of the Big Bang. And then it becomes a lot more silent, and then slowly instruments and different pieces start being incorporated again after that large, percussion fit. So it starts with this Big Bang, and as you watch it, you see formation of galaxies. You kind of see like a Milky Way starting to spiral around. Then you see what looks like the formation of the Earth itself, followed by it goes all the way and zooms into like the deep ocean, and there's like these single-celled organisms with little flagella that are like spinning them around. Almost looks like a science clip. And then these guys start dividing themselves, turning into more and more complicated organisms. You start seeing jellyfish emerge and crustaceans emerge. All of a sudden, there's like a turtle-looking dinosaur. There's probably a name for it, but it crawls out of the ocean onto the land. So it's animating these huge milestones along with the music, and eventually dinosaurs start walking around. They succumb to this great drought, and then all of a sudden there's lava and volcanoes exploding, and this is kind of indicating, I don't think they actually show it, but like the meteor hit or the extinction of all the dinosaurs. So the animation that they take to this is very much this idea of like generation. It looks very scientific, at least from like this evolutionary point of view. It's almost like they're just animating the story of evolution as it's been, taught in schools. But then if you look what the actual music was about for Rite of Spring, it has, very specifically occult connotations. So instead of these single-celled organisms multiplying, coming into being, we've got, I'm pulling some of this from some of the wiki on the breakdown of Rite of Spring. So when it gets translated, the very first section is called the Adoration of the Earth. And again, what is this first section of the Fantasia animation about? It's about Earth kind of coming together and being formed. So the actual Rite of Spring starts out with the introduction with an orchestral, and it's supposed to say a swarm of spring pipes. And then after this becomes the August of Spring. So they start celebrating it in the hills, and an old woman enters and begins to foretell the future. Finally, the next one is the ritual of abduction. And this is where these young girls arrive from the river. They are standing in a single file line, and they begin this dance of the abduction. And this basically invites this old man to come and kind of whisk them away, where they go into the dance of the earth. And it's almost like a feverish dance where they become into a passionate dance and become one with the earth itself. So again, there's a very loose tie of what the original Rite of Spring was meant to convey and the animation that we see. But there's correlations between all of them. And another interesting part of this is in the second part of the Rite of Spring is called the sacrifice. And this is where the girls, essentially, one of them gets chosen to dance herself to death. And dancing to death is this like sacrifice onto the earth. So this, again, it ends in death, just like the end of the animation in Fantasia. It dies with, or it ends with all these dinosaurs dying, and you see their bones, and they're just kind of being crushed and ground back into the earth. And the idea here is the next scene is that new life comes from this kind of sacrifice that was given to the earth. So, I mean, the way that I see it is they seem so different, but they are both alluding to this same tale of making sacrifices onto the earth to make way for this new Rite of Spring.
And when this premiered, the Rite of Spring, the piece, the ballet, it didn't go well. I think it had like Stravinsky getting like pelted with tomatoes or something after. It was just seen as debased, like the music was so out there and the dancing was too lurid, and I guess dancing yourself to death. It kind of was controversial at the time. And in 1940, this much evolution on screen would probably still rankle a few feathers, I would imagine, as well.
And it's kind of appropriate too, because part of this, I don't necessarily know if the Fantasia's version of Rite of Spring caused the same uproar. I mean, they literally were calling it a riot afterwards. when they were writing about that initial debut, because it was so avant-garde. But I wonder if it was because people were offended, or if it just subverted their expectations so much that they felt like they hated it because it didn't satisfy what they were expecting to find out of it.
Yeah, there'd already been a few major atonal pieces before that, I think. So I don't think that's what would have done it. And just to respond, I feel like this is before they had really theorized about the meteor hit. So it seems that they just assumed the Earth was exploding, but in a sacrifice way that certainly kind of tracks. One thing, I guess, the climax of this segment is the Stegosaurus T-Rex battle, which was recreated on the Disneyland train, kind of.
And this is a good example of something that I'd be a little bit surprised to see frame for frame, at least in like a modern Disney movie, because it's very like cold and callous and sort of brutal, the way that it's represented in Fantasia, I believe.
Yeah, and watching it last night, I'm like, wow, this is actually a pretty intense death, fighting this much over seaweed too. So
and they kick it off right. I mean, it's within like the first like 10 to 15 minutes. You see all these cute dinosaurs and animals that were roaming around are all just like getting fighting with each other over like scarce resources, and this brutal scene with the T-Rex, and then they all like slowly die and wither away. It's very somber for the very beginning of a Disney movie.
There's actually a museum not far from here where they have, did I say Disney? There's a museum, science museum. Okay. There's a science museum not far from here where they have a real nice like animatronic dinosaur. And they show this movie there, which is like really terrible CGI about the meteor hit end of the dinosaurs. And I just for saying the harrowing ending, it ends with like the baby dinosaur with its dead mother in the cold, like whining, and then the movie just ends. I'm like, whoa, that was intense. So there's like kids crying in the theater.
I mean, like Land Before Time was very similar to that. That wasn't a Disney movie, but that had a similar, like, it opened up and you make friends with all these characters, and then everyone's parents are dead and they have to go and find, like new parents.
Oh, okay. See the end of this one. That is the end. This is the last of the dinosaurs. It's a whining baby dinosaur. So, I guess we'll take a look at the next segment just to keep time on a clip. For your narrative list, what comes after The Rite of Spring?
So the reason why this one comes next is the Nutcracker Suite, Dance of the Hours, and then Carnival of Animals and Brave Tin Soldier. These are kind of all smashed together, but specifically Dance of the Hours. And the reason why this one comes next is, again, if we go back to there's some qualifiers here. So first of all, again, they didn't sit down and decide like what animations we're going to go with, what songs and what order all the songs we're going to go in. At least I don't think that was ever the plan originally. And you mentioned some other reasons why, because it was used to kind of get like a lot of replay value and show different clips as they went. But all that said, because of the Demolay connection, which is this Masonic adjacent, there's also this concept in Masonry and a lot of other sort of secret mystery schools where you pay attention to the construction of architecture, and the architecture gives you an indication of how complex the society that created is. So in Dance of the Hours, they actually have these Ionic columns, which are one of the most basic forms of columns. And this sort of, in a chronological bias, complexity of civilization way, it dates the Dance of Hours to be earlier than, for example, in the Pastoral Symphony, because these ones show door, or actually I might have these reversed. The Pastoral Symphony with the Doric columns and the Dance of the Hours with the Ionic columns.
Yeah, I saw, and that's basically the carving degree of carving detail.
Yeah. So yes, I'm gonna butcher some of this because I'm so rusty on my classic Greek and Roman architecture. It's not something that comes up very often, but essentially you've got Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, composite, and there's one other one that kind of fits in between some of those, but it goes from like the most basic, so it's just a pillar with the caps and very little like filigrees and ornate additions to it, going all the way up to the most ornate that's got all sorts of filigrees and like little like leaves carved out of stone that kind of weave themselves in and out. And sometimes they even have like astrological stories that are like carved into the columns themselves. So you can sort of look at the ornateness of a column, at least in classical speaking, of figuring out like which one came first, because there's a natural progression of, as civilizations became more evolved, they kind of like built on top of what the previous architects or masons, Freemasons, were kind of building. So it was always constantly getting more and more complicated. And now that took a definite change sometime after like the 17th or 18th century, and then brutalism kind of came in, and postmodern, and so like this concept of being more ornate, meaning that you were more advanced, sort of fell out of favor. But when you go back to classical artworks, that's very much a way that you can date things, not to the exact year, but to chronologically organize them.
I'm in the middle of a book about guitars, but not like specifically guitars. It's talking about like how they get the wood, how the sawmills, which seems almost boring, but you start reading, it's very interesting, talking about the difference between these craft things and industrial things. So an industrial sawmill is way, way, way bigger than a guitar wood, tone wood sawmill, because those go through all these logs, where at these the artisans making these instruments, I mean, this would go for violins, cellos as well, they're like, maybe 1 out of 1,000 logs is okay for our purposes to make this instrument. So in the modern world, we have to make so many things and have so many materials. I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons I guess we don't see so much like artisanal stuff anymore.
I mean, it's less efficient, and also a lot of these time periods when these very ornate things were being created, there wasn't necessarily like labor laws that got in the way of, people calling it quits after their 40 hours, or, so it was a completely different environment that enabled these, quote unquote, like more civilized designs to appear. But as you have to like start paying people wages and letting them go home after a day's of work, some of that stuff kind of fell to the wayside.
Well, again, that just to tie things back in, that would be guilds making that happen, with which the Masons would have originally been a guild.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's full circle. Absolutely.
I guess we'll talk about pastoral a little bit then, which I have played in the cello section of I think pretty much every Beethoven symphony, because that's going to happen when you've been playing for a while. So it's another one where I can kind of get my head in the music. Like Dance of the Hours, once I just start hearing the Hello Mother, Hello Father, I've been smoking marijuana song. So hello mother, hello father. Yeah. I think there's another version, but let's go into pastoral a little bit. This one's kind of interesting musically. It doesn't, like, not much is going on. There's a storm somewhere in the middle of the symphony, but it's kind of a calm one. I did notice this one actually puts, I don't think they follow all the repeats, but basically in the entire symphonies here, they didn't really edit it, which I always kind of thought they did.
Well, and this one's interesting because story-wise, when you're watching it, it almost looks like Zeus makes this appearance, and you're like, okay, Zeus, the guy that throws the lightning bolts, this big lightning storm. This lightning storm represents Zeus, and it's the creation of Zeus. But watching it more carefully, the storyline, no matter what kind of order you watch it in, it's kind of about Mickey Mouse, the sorcerer's apprentice, trying to skirt his responsibility. He doesn't want to clean up with the mops and the brooms, and he's kind of like taking these shortcuts. It almost implies that he kind of like snuck in here and went through this magic grimoire and started casting these spells to shirk his responsibility. And it was really Yen Sid, Disney spelled backwards, who's like the actual wizard here, that it was almost like Mickey like snuck in and was doing these things that he wasn't supposed to be doing. So the Pastoral Symphony, despite it seeming like it's Zeus, an interesting way to look at this sequence is that this is all the result of everything that Mickey's done, and it has this kind of cacophonic feel to it as well, which then summons Zeus. It's like attracting his attention to say, like, who's making all that noise out there? It's like you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear like banging pots and pans in the kitchen. You think, oh, my kid got into the kitchen. What the hell are they doing at midnight, in the kitchen, banging all this stuff? it very much has that aspect to it where the Pastoral Symphony is representative of Zeus taking notice of this mess that Mickey is kind of made out, out in the world.
One contrast, this is one where I recently watched the other film. So in Soylent Green, they have the sequence where Edward G. Robinson's character goes to the suicide parlor, basically, or the euthanasia parlor, and they put him in a big, it's kind of a circle in the round theater, and he's in put on a recliner and given whatever is going to kill him. And while the Pastoral Symphony plays and shows him all the images of an earth that's gone. So I just thought that's
a pretty rough way to go, I gotta say.
Well, it's supposed to be a really nice way to go. He's been living in an overpopulated place where they're just eating Soylent Green. There's no nature left. So it's like, here, we'll show you the lost nature while you zoom out of life. And yeah, I guess this is bringing in life. So it's kind of interesting that that's a little bit of the opposite in Soylent Green. Like you're seeing reflections of all the nature gone while you die. But yeah, it does show, like the power of a good piece of music is you can take the completely opposite interpretation and both work pretty well. So we have a lot of pans here. I actually wrote cupids, and then when I was went back, I was like, wait a minute, no, these are pans that are kind of going around and making things happen here.
If you notice, the actual artwork gets reused later on in some Disney animations that they are cupids, but in this one it starts out as Pan. And this one, again, I think it's telling the story depending on the order that you watch it, but to me the Pan would almost come before Chernabog, maybe, or maybe immediately directly after it, because you take it from this sort of puritanical American point of view. Pan sort of represents that pagan element that perhaps Chernabog also represents. Just they portray Pan as this cute, cuddly, multicolored little like woodland nymph almost. It's like dancing and playing a lyre, and he's smiling and hopping, and you almost want to go and buy the stuffed animal and give it to your kid. You're not going to want to go out and buy the Chernabog animal and give that to your kid after the movie, but essentially in terms of like folklore context, Pan and Chernabog sort of hold the equal weighting within occult definitions.
Yeah, it's the image that comes across. Another example here would be a lot of temples in Asia have the protective demons at the temple gates, but they look terrifying. But they're supposed to be, protecting the temple and making it a pure place. That's why they look so terrifying.
Well, actually, this is one of the topics that I really love getting into, because now we're talking about archetypes that transcend culture and language. So almost every culture has got these archetypes of like the stern protector that's there, like the Tyler of the Lodge, or the bodyguard, or the archangels, or even the guardian angels can be very stern. These are archetypes that you can find in almost any sort of story. And just like Pan here is the trickster in some regards, in Fantasia animation, they don't necessarily portray him as a trickster, but there's no other way to interpret Pan, the character, aside from being a trickster, because that's essentially his role to play in every story that he's incorporated in. And then the fact that Pan himself sort of represents just paganism as a whole. I love the kind of like lofty, cartoony aspect to him that makes it so cute in Fantasia.
Yeah, my note was, this is weirdly corny stuff with horses in 1940.
And it's very technicolor. There's like unicorns and rainbows coming out from behind them, and there's a little bit of a corny aspect to that too. But I would also say that if you were sitting down and watching this for the first time when it first came out, some of these colors and combinations and just ideas seem like it would have been overwhelmingly, awesome to watch. Like it would have definitely been completely different than the short little things that you saw before movies prior to this.
Oh, another weird Japanese archetype. This one's not even a caught, but I see it everywhere. And I had to ask my wife about it. She's Japanese, and a lot of ramen shops, especially, it seems to be ramen shops most of the time, it'll have a picture of the chef, just like just looking really angry. And I'm like, why do I keep seeing this?
Does he have a knife?
Yeah, no. The explanation is, oh, well, he's serious about making the ramen, because in the States you'd show like a happy looking inviting chef, where here they have this dude that looks totally pissed off. Oh, well, he's serious about the ramen, so it must be the idea is it must be really
in the
good.
States it always looks like a promo for like their reality show or something.
Yeah, exactly. We see that too, but that was one. Just the idea of this fearsome face being the inviting face in the end, or the protector of the serious face, is interesting, and how different cultures interpret that. Um, I guess we have to bring up, this is the infamous banned Disney segment as well, with the they took out the black unicorn, I believe, who the explanation is, I think, because she was appearing in what seemed to be a subservient role. Do you know what I'm getting
No,
at?
you're gonna have to
Okay.
inform me on some of this.
This is when the centaurs are frolicking in the around the pond or whatever. And
Okay, yeah,
there's,
we're the same segment here.
I think you actually can spot the centaur in a few spots, like in the background, if I remember. But there is one where she's featured, but she's like, I don't know, like washing the hooves of another one or something. So they have panned and scanned it in to take her out. Maybe it's the two
Oh, I didn't
golden
even
haired.
notice that.
I think it's the two golden hair young lover centaurs, and that's a zoomed in shot because they've edited out this one centaur, just as a banned Disney fun fact.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the things that Disney puts out, they have a lot of control over the versions. Like, are you familiar with the Disney Vault concept?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
have some of those.
so Disney has almost unprecedented control over the media, at least pre-internet, right? Now with post-internet, you can seek out all of like the unbanned and unedited versions prior to all this, and they're always worth watching because there's a lot of Disney movies where small scenes get taken out and clips of dialogue. I think that for a while, it might not have been on the Disney Channel Plus, but on one of the paid services, they kind of had like classic Disney, and when you went to play it, it always started with like a disclaimer of, this was written and animated in a completely different time. But they mentioned that they intentionally leave things that were typically edited out in future DVD releases. They leave it in on some of the streaming services. I think that was probably pre Disney Plus.
Yeah, I used to blow people's minds with Der Fuhrer's face, which they did put out on DVD at least once. So, which, if for those that don't know it, that basically has Donald Duck as Hitler, Zeke Heiling and everything. It's pretty wild.
I mean, to be fair, he was supposed to be like the bad guy in that, but just the fact that they branded one of their main characters as Hitler is yeah.
Yeah. That's pastoral. We were also, I guess, talking about Dance of the Hours a little bit in tandem. For me, I felt like that was one where it's like, I don't know if I can really tie in much depth. I mean, you mentioned the columns, and it's like, oh, that's a lot more depth than I picked up in the
I had to
first place.
stretch pretty far to get some depth out of it. Yeah, there's also an element of elephants in both of those scenes that feature columns, and very loose correlation here, but the ones that are dancing in the tutus do seem as though they could be potentially like more advanced of a culture if you wanted to classify, dancing hippos into different cultures. The ones with the more advanced architectural columns also came after the more simple sort of like personalities, which is, again, it's a very long stretch here, but if we're trying to find something for each of the segments, that's probably the most like occult, esoteric, interesting aspect if you want to like read really, really deep into it.
Yeah, I can't remember where I read this, so it's completely unsubstantiated. But I do seem to remember at least some cultures referring to elephants as a symbol of knowledge.
Yeah, it's like depends on the culture you're talking about. There's also one of the first in Dumbo, they reused this concept of the pink elephant. I think when Dumbo gets drunk or he gets inebriated, that's in my mind that's a way more iconic version of maybe what you kind of see echoes of in this film.
No, I actually, the pink elephant scene is pretty much my favorite bit of Disney animation. So
That's a creepy one, man. I mean, if you were to just sit your kid down in front of that without building up to it, it's definitely a little bit of a creepy animation.
yeah, we got the rest of the movie in first, but I'm like, this is like fully psychedelic. That's
Yeah.
wild. So, um, oh, and this is the last thing on Dance of the Hours. I did find it weird. Like, yeah, they're kind of like not sexualizing. Oh, sure, sexualizing these giant animals. I'm like, that's kind of weird.
I mean, if you're sitting down in this dark office just drawing, female hippos for months on end, this comes up too in other Disney films where animators will sneak in sort of hidden messages or, naughty little bits here and there. I mean, that I believe same thing. If you see some weird sexualization of like an inanimate object or what another one's like Beauty and the Beast, right? They make like the candlestick like have like these sexual sort of like gait as it walks and things like this. I feel like at least half of this is just a side effect of an animator that's been stuck in a dark room for far too long.
Oh, I teach kids in Japan, so I was teaching like 4 or 5 year olds, and I was using this Dr. Seuss ABC book, and I'm on letter R, and a kid just starts looking up and going chin chin, which means penis in Japanese. So I'm kind of like, oh, don't say that now. And then I look down, I'm like, Dr. Seuss drew the rhinoceros nose to look like a cock. So I was like, okay, kid, that was actually a pretty astute observation there.
He's got some band works as well now.
Yeah. Oh, and we follow the yeah, I remember hearing about that. We followed these elephants and hippos with the red robed crocodile, so a little bit of a eyes wide shut vibe if we're really stretching.
And there, I mean, honestly, I would have to do a much deeper dive than I've had time to, but there's probably some interesting astrological things that you could assume out of all of this. Because from not just straight astrology symbols, but also like the family crests and the animals that would represent different families throughout history and time periods. The hippo and the alligator and the ostriches specifically all actually have very strong sort of occult connotations. Again, depending on the culture and the time period, like an elephant could mean intelligence or it could mean the opposite of intelligence. It all depends on what your context is.
Yeah, actually, I think we're both talking each other into saying there might be a little more to the segment than we thought at first.
Oh, I mean, there absolutely is. It would take watching these segments many, many times over and just reading into them.
Yeah, that's not the one I want to watch over and over. Rite of Spring, sure, Bald Mountain, I'll watch that over and over.
Yeah, if you want to go deep, I mean, Bald Mountain's probably my favorite one on the whole thing, just because it's the most, overtly occult, and it's also, I think you might have a better insight on this, but I believe that Night on Bald Mountain is the most direct translation of this animation looks very close to what the music theme itself was written around.
Yeah, Mussorgsky wrote a letter, just to one of his friends when he composed it, and more or less describes what you're seeing in this animation. Let's see if I think I might even have that up. Nah, I was reading it not too long ago, but it seems I don't have that.
I've got his letter here if you want me to read.
Oh yeah, sure. If you want, yeah, go ahead and give us the letter.
So this was a letter from him to Vladimir Nikolsky, and he says, "So far as my memory doesn't deceive me, the witches used to gather on this mountain, gossip, play tricks, and await their chief Satan. On his arrival, the witches formed a circle around the throne on which he sat in the form of a kid and sang his praise. And when Satan was worked up into a sufficient passion by the witches' praises, he gave the command for the Sabbath, in which he chose for himself the witches who caught his fancy." So before I finished what he was writing in this letter, I just want to harken back that this is very, very close to that Rite of Spring, sort of like story where instead of witches, it's like these fair maidens, and they go up onto the field instead of a mountain, and one of them is chosen to dance themselves to death and sacrifice unto the earth. So again, we've got this group of witches that go onto a mountain, and some of them get chosen to become a sacrifice for, in this case, Chernabog or Satan. And Chernabog, I believe, translates to black god. So anyways, the finished rest of his note here, he says, at the head of my score, I've put these contents. First, assembly of the witches, their talk and their gossip. 2, Satan's journey. 3, obscene praises of Satan. And then 4, the Sabbath. The form and character of the composition are Russian and original. I wrote St. John's Eve quickly, straight always in full score. I wrote about it in 12 days. So he's mentioning, it was almost like this feverish thing that was in him, and he just had to get out. It wasn't something that he had been necessarily working on over many years, at least not the final product that he put down on paper. And also the reason why St. John's Eve is important here is that St. John's Eve is essentially a representation of summer solstice. This is midsummer. So if you've seen like the scary movie Midsummer, if you've seen, you know, that was like a horror movie, but the concept of winter solstice and summer solstice, this is what this was written about, this original piece, and this witch's Sabbath. This happens on that Midsummer's Eve, and it's leading up to this event of Chernabog.
Yeah, I have not seen that movie yet, but it is on my list of things to get to. But a couple things about Mussorgsky that's kind of interesting. I think he didn't have the formal training of most composers and was a bit of an outsider. So and a bit gruff in personality, like in the music world, he wasn't like that well liked. The other thing about him, and I don't know if this has bearing or not, it said he scored this in 12 days, which is actually interesting because he usually shied away from scoring. Other than this, his best known piece is Pictures at an Exhibition, which he only wrote on piano. Someone later turned it into like a symphonic work. So it's kind of this outsider guy. It's almost like, you know, maybe this is the story and the music is an outpouring of his frustration or something.
I mean, I really do love reading some of the history on this one, because like when you watch Fantasia and you see the animation first, it's hard for me at least to separate the visuals that are being presented to me from if I just sat down and listened to it without ever having seen visuals. So it's hard for me because I definitely saw the animation probably the first time that I heard this and actually was paying attention to it. But I want to believe that if I sat down and I knew what he was writing about and just listened to the music, the things that he's evoking through the music alone very much correspond to what you're hearing. And so he had, in the actual animation, it doesn't necessarily have all these even breaking points where you can see it transitioning from one step to the other, but he kind of had a list of exactly how he wanted it to come across. So it starts with this subterraneous roar of non-human voices and uttering non-human words, and then these kind of these murmurs are supposed to be bringing this sleeping peasant out into the mountain essentially, and then it turns into this like foreboding and foreshadowing Chernabog as he kind of like rises out of this mountain, which I believe is based on an actual mountain. It's called like the three-headed mountain, or the mountain with three giants or something, but technically it was much farther away from where this ritual was rumored to have taken place. So I think he kind of mixed geography up a little bit to make the story make more sense based on incorporating different forms of folklore essentially.
Yeah. I was just thinking we have these very, they're volcanic, not satanic, but there's a outcropping of volcanic rocks not far from here, which kind of has that look. You can just like kind of walk around in there and it feel like you're in hell for a while. That's actually what's called Oniashidashi, which is like the devil's plain. So
are there any like folklore or any like, I guess, like urban legends around that area, or not so much?
Oh God, there's tons of them. Yeah. Nagano itself has quite a bit. I'm trying to think of one that's specifically Nagano. Well, there's lots of fun Japanese urban legends where you meet the woman wearing a mask on the street, and this predates COVID by far, by the way. A woman's wearing a mask on the street. The young woman asks if you think she's beautiful, And if you say yes or something, she'll take off the mask and she's like horribly scored. And if you like wince, she'll kill you or something.
Was it
So
like a Medusa legend in a way?
a little bit, yeah. I think if you don't respond though, she'll go away. I don't quite remember. So
What's the moral of that story? Because usually in the Western mythology, there's like a moral to like why they act a certain way. So what would be the reason behind that? Or is there one?
um beauty's only skin deep, I guess.
But or it's just like just ignore people that
Yeah,
ignore people that ask you to talk
something
to
like
them.
that. Oh, here's a fun one. This is elementary schools all across Japan. They actually, I think Harry Potter borrowed this concept because they have Hanako, which is the girl ghost in the elementary school toilet.
It's that specific.
Yeah. Her name's Hanako. She lives in the elementary school toilet. Like a year or two ago, my daughter had picked up a manga which was translated to toilet bound Hanako Kun. Kun's a boy. So the thing of the manga was no, it's actually a boy. So it's popular enough for someone to like do that tweak and make a manga out of it.
Is this like every school? There's theoretically a ghost in the bathroom.
Yeah, pretty much. Especially the
That's
old ones.
interesting.
Yeah, because my daughter, she just started junior high. She's in a nice new modern building, but her elementary school is positively ancient. And I'm like, I kept asking, oh, there's got to be ghosts in there. And she was like, no, I just kept telling the other kids there were ghosts. I don't think there were any ghosts. So she was the instigator of the stories there. But yeah, the toilet bound Hanako is definitely a fun urban legend, I guess, that ended up.
I'm curious when you talk about ghosts. There is there the same concept of like it has unfinished business, so a ghost is almost like a problem that is looking for a solution, or is it more embraced as like it's just a ghost?
It's more, I guess I should be using the word spirit more than ghost. Now as far as Hanako and the toilet, I
Well, I
guess
guess
that's more
either
of a
or,
ghost,
because
but
there's not really such thing as like a spirit necessarily, and that I'm aware of in like Western modern culture. It's if you see an actual spirit, it's pretty much a ghost, unless you are of some other specific religion. But
it's
even if you're like a religious, if you saw a spirit or talk about seeing a spirit, it's like interchangeable with ghost.
actually some of the Ghibli films have some pretty good sort of representations of the Japanese vibe. Totoro is the spirit of the mountain, and there's kind of this underworld of spirits with you got the cat bus. Sen no Chihiro's Spirited Away has that same thing where they aren't ghosts, they're spirits that are at this bathhouse.
Yeah, I've seen that one. They're almost described as like echoes at some point, I think.
Right. That's why I like the Yokai Watch anime somewhat. I mean, it's a silly anime basically for kids, but I was entertained by it. I liked it. Um, but yeah, the idea is the yokai go and kind of like both cause and solve actual people's problems. So that's where it gets a little Pokemon because you pit your yokai against this other yokai trying to cause a
That's
problem. So
interesting.
yeah. What was there? Like, there's the dog-faced lawyer or something. No, it's a lawyer-faced dog. It's like this dog that has a face of a lawyer, and that one is more of a ghost because he actually did used to be a human, but he's been warped into some kind of spirit. So it's a little the concept's a little different. Yeah, I remember it took me a few years to work out the whole concept of the um ghosts and spirits in Japan. So it is different.
So I'm curious on a slight tangent here, but I know that there's Freemasonry in Japan. So the concept of like Western occultism obviously exists there, and it's not a complete, foreign concept to everybody. But is there a different form of like occultism that you're aware of that's not fitting into the same mold as like European-based occultism?
Oh, absolutely. Excuse me. One would be, you'll often find like near a train station or something, someone set up like a little table with the cloth over it, and they're doing like this certain kind of palm reading, but it's a little different than the Western version. They have a different idea of how that works, but it's just set up like it's not like you have
Well,
to go in a
is the
back
end
alley.
result that you pay them money?
Yeah, kind of. And like I said, when people at the beginning of the year or they have a big test coming up, they'll go and they'll buy a little fortune from the temple. So this year my family went. My daughter got the best fortune, and I got the least fortune. Oh well, I guess
So
it's better.
does that count as religious in any way, in your opinion?
That's what I'm saying. It's kind of like a thing that people do at that time. I mean, there are people that will go off and become monks. There was a J-pop band about 10 years ago called Funky Monkey Babies, and they weren't funky at all, but whatever. But the guy that produced the music, when you'd see them, it'd be two guys up front singing, and then a guy at the back basically just waving his hands because he already produced the music. But he quit to become a monk because his family, he was in the lineage to become a monk. He's like, well, I'm going to go be a J-pop star for 5 years and then go be a monk. So
That's pretty cool.
so that was kind of interesting. But I think a big difference is no one evangelizes. Like, no one's going to be like, you need to become Buddhist, you need to pray to the spirits. Like, no, we go to the shrine in town because that's emblematic of our town. That's like, the spiritual center of our town. It's not necessarily believing anything. We're not believing anything. So, I mean, you can get quite serious about religion if you want to in Japan, but no one really just turns their back on religion because there's nothing to really turn your back on.
Do you notice any sort of like astrological signs baked into
They go
ancient
Chinese calendar.
architecture? And yeah,
They go Chinese calendar, so it's by year. Oh, here's a big one. What's your blood type?
I think it's B positive.
But you're not sure. I can only remember what mine is, but that's a big thing in Japan. Your blood type is like what's your sign? It's what's your blood type.
Really?
So each blood type fits a certain personality profile according to Japanese thought. And
that's almost like what's your star sign, but it's what's your blood type.
Yeah, so it's not astrology as much as blood types, which I guess makes a little more sense. Like, as far as like just how the world's atmosphere at the time is, I think astrology has something to it. But am I going to find a new girlfriend tomorrow? Probably not. But yeah, but
well, and just to be clear too, I think the reason at least I'm really fascinated by astrology and how it ties into occultism is that a lot of the times you'll see astrological signs and artwork and things baked into, say, like religious texts or just into like architecture. A lot of those times the astrological symbols are there to like date things or to describe a story of here's what came first, here's what came after. Or for example, like the concept of Aquarius or the water bear is very often used to represent the concept of knowledge. So whenever you see that astrological sign, it's also almost like a little Cliff Notes indicator of like when you see this icon somewhere, whatever the context, it's actually talking about human consciousness or knowledge or gaining knowledge or expanding your horizons in sort of like an academic way. So then when you actually see it used in places, there's a phrase of like, if you have the eyes that know how to see, then like when you see this thing, it's not just a scorpion on this guy's foot, and it's it's representing like the constellation of Scorpio, and it might be him doing the artwork that you're looking at. It might be trying to present it in a certain context that relates directly to that. So I guess I don't know if there's any sort of like example of like a classic artwork or architecture that you walk around and you just notice like, oh, there's always like a dog there. There's always I don't know what all the constellations are and the animals and the stories that they represent, but very often they can be incorporated in places where they're there to like have you remember certain aspects of stories and then correlate that message of the story to whatever you're looking at.
Oh yeah, all the carvings and things, like in the temples specifically. One interesting thing is when you see a temple's architecture, so there's kind of main temples. I live in Nagano. We have Zenkoji, which is one of Japan's main temples. Nikko is a pretty famous site where they have this very ornate main temple, and then that temple franchises. So as you get maybe in a radius of, it could be like 100 miles or 500 if it's a really big temple, you'll find smaller ones in that same design with many of the same visual elements because it's kind of affiliated with this main temple. And you'll see them next to each other. So if you see this really red one with lots of colorful carvings, oh, that's the one in Nikko. Whereas you see kind of an austere, Zen wood-hued temple, that's the Nagano one, for example.
And you pick up that based on the color palette and the types of architecture?
Exactly. Once you become familiar with the way this certain brand of temple looks, I mean, it's like how we can recognize a McDonald's and a KFC from each other.
Yeah, so I guess from an occult aspect, it would be looking into like why those specific colors, does that particular color represent some deeper meaning of some story, that if you knew the underlying story, then it's like, oh, well, the reason that color is red is because of, the blood that this particular animal bled when it went through this process. And that's kind of like that deeper occult meanings. It's really fun to kind of pick apart.
Yeah, like you're mentioning, no, there aren't people that are so much I'm religious, but I do a fair amount of meditation, usually on my lunch break, and I go to a couple temples near my work, and I'll do a few of the Wim Hof breathing things, and I got a breathing exercise, but most of them I'm sitting up, straight, but a few of them I might lie on my back, and I've noticed looking up, and the ceilings of these temples are very rough hewn logs. I mean, they've been worked on. Nagano is well known for not road work, woodwork, but it's like, so it's been worked on by skilled craftsmen, but it hasn't been given straight edges. Everything's still natural, and as Alan Watts might say, everything's still squiggly and not
Yeah,
prickly.
no, I love Alan Watts.
So they leave it squiggly, but they leave it in the ceiling of the temple. So when I'm lying flat on my back, I'm like, oh, there's these three big logs, but you really have to be looking for them. In the family house, there's some sculptures and a table or two, which is just totally weird, squiggly wood. So I do like the idea of, oh, we're going to take this wood and kind of try and keep some. We're gonna polish it, make sure you don't get splinters from it, make it kind of shiny, but it's going to keep its natural form.
There's I don't this It correlates in my brain. I don't think that there's like an actual real world correlation between these two, but the concept of like this finished yet unfinished raw material, the exact same thing that happens at least in the Catholic Church, where typically the altar that the father stands behind is usually a unfinished piece of stone, and it's supposed to represent like humanity as this unfinished piece of work that is yet to be perfected. So whenever you see an intentional unfinished component, especially like part of a foundation or like the roof of a temple, that always makes me think back to this symbolism of, this is a house where you're trying to connect to this higher spiritual power or whatever, and the fact that this unfinished wood kind of represents that the things inside this temple are also unfinished and wanting to become more polished.
Yeah, a lot of places in Japan actually take that a step farther. When you visit a grand old cathedral, it's quite old. It might even be a bit of a ruin. Like in England, the older cathedrals, they've been there forever. They were built to last, but they look quite different now than they did. Say, I think Notre Dame used to be like pastel colored inside. It's like, things like
Yeah,
that.
that's a really cool thing, is that almost all of the classical like busts and sculptures that you see constantly in pictures and movies and repurposed, a lot of those were painted to be, like flesh colored at one point, and then other points they had gnarly, probably like psychedelic vibrant colors, and most of the time just the elements and the sun and just, erosion knocked all that paint off, to the point where people got so used to seeing it as this like unfinished pure marble sculptures, not realizing that they very frequently were painted.
The contrast in Japan is if you go to a temple that's been here for 900 years, 900-year-old temple, it looks exactly like it did 900 years ago. The reason being they tore it down and rebuilt it 50 years ago. So they'll tear it down and rebuild it exactly how it was. So when you see these historical sites, you're absolutely not seeing the original, but you're seeing something that looks more like the original, because these are, when you tear it down, you have to make sure you're going to rebuild it exactly the same. So
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because a lot of different cultures throughout time give more or less importance on sort of retaining that, like the actual artifacts, versus just knowing that they were there and just building back on top of them is just as good as like preserving the actual foundation, and, at all costs making sure that you preserve it forever. That it kind of goes through ebbs and flows on how much certain cultures care about, retaining all of that.
yeah, I've been
And
to
I don't think there's like a pro or con on that, because because if you look at it from, so again, like an occult perspective, the whole concept of a magic ritual is not about the place that it happens in, or even like the specific tools that you're using. And even if you extend this to like the Christian church, there's a lot of factions that necessarily it's, if you just get enough people together and congregate, you've just formed a church. It doesn't matter if it's in a field or if it's in a fancy building. When it comes to like magic occult rituals, it's all about the repetition, and it's almost this concept of like reverberation, where you put this prayer, or you put this ritual out, or you go and you meditate, and if you just keep meditating in the same place for thousands and thousands of years, just the fact that people keep going to that same place and doing that same action is a religious act. Even if you're not a religious person, just that act itself is by definition religious. And that could be construed as this like magical ritual that you're just strengthening over time. If 1,000 people are going to a specific place with a specific intent and acting on that intent, that's almost textbook definition of magic, whether you believe in like the woo-woo aspects of it or not.
No, I mean, when I go to these temples and do my thing, I always sit in exactly the same spot. So
it's a religious experience. Even some people, add these connotations to religion as if it means that you have to be worshiping some old dude in the sky with a beard, or you have to be worshiping, a fat guy under a tree, or but none of that really necessarily is required for being religious. Religious is just doing the same thing over and over and believing that, you doing that over and over is having some greater effect than just like the most obvious superficial versions of it.
yeah, like it becomes so rote. Sometimes you're like, is this still working? And then it'll be like, whoa, did 5 hours just pass? And nope, that was 5 minutes. So something worked there. So that's kind of cool. Let me see. I just want to look at Bald Mountain. We got to get to Mickey before we're finished. But
well, I wanted to mention too that in Bald Mountain, again, Disney being a very American and cultured film, and the point of time that it came out, but to harken back to this theme of sort of puritanical vision, and looking at these things as if it's like God versus Satan almost. If there's pagans in it, that's Satan. If there's Chernobog, that's Satan. Everything is Satan. And almost like clockwork, the very end of that scene on Bald Mountain, you actually hear Ave Maria. That's the song that all of the villagers, they begin to kind of sing, and they're marching through the town. And this is what sort of subdues Chernobog and forces him to like wrap himself up and go back into that mountain. And this is almost impossible to not see as like the concept of this Christian God being called upon to sort of, shine light on this evil Chernobog. So again, it's kind of not just the American Christian aspect, but this occult aspect of, calling upon the light to cast out the darkness. And it's played for visually almost beat for beat here.
well, yeah, you can't tell if they're carrying candles or if they just have halos. So I thought that was
when I watch it, I mean, they look like more pagan monks, going out to do another magic ritual. Who knows? But clearly the music there is not an accidental inclusion to follow up the black god with Ave Maria.
No, I mean, they say it in the narration. They were kind of mashed up on purpose. So, there's not even any duplicity. He says it right out front. The other one that got me in the end was the clouds. They looked really UFO-like in 1940. Like they looked like the 1950s sort of UFOs in the sky. And I thought that was weird.
I didn't pick that out, although it's an interesting observation.
Yeah. So, I think I had one more. I just was gonna say it's the most metal thing that predates Black Sabbath. And what do you prefer, Bill and Ted's Hell or Fantasia's Hell?
Well, prefer in what way? As an outside observer or a person going through it?
I just as a personal taste matter.
Probably Bill and Ted, I think. I just like the concept of being able to cheat death, and that death tries to cheat you back. I just love that idea.
Yeah. That's my favorite cinematic hell. That's why I'm bringing it up.
Well, and I also got to see that one in the theater, so I've got a special nostalgic place for Bill and Ted's Hell versus Fantasia, which I'm almost positive I first saw on VHS, and it might not have been the most interesting movie I had seen at that point either.
I've got to wrap this up before too long, but we definitely have to talk a little bit more about the Sorcerer's Apprentice. That's sort of the calling card of this whole movie.
Well, and we barely even touched about Yen Sid, which has, you know, he's the wizard, he's Disney himself, and Mickey being the Sorcerer's Apprentice, like that's the sorcerer. So he's just an apprentice to Yen Sid.
And yeah, that is an interesting thing. When you do get into magical things or occult things, just how you go about them, because he's doing it. I guess Mickey's flaw here is doing it out of his own personal laziness.
Out of his laziness, and also a very common underlying theme when you get into like occult topics is this idea of profanity. And I don't mean bad words, I mean like a profane student that is trying to read some magical text or understand some outside of magical thinking. It would be like someone approaching a very deep, complex philosophical theory, and it just completely filling them up with like depression to the point of suicide, and they just like exit the world because they revealed some truth that their brain was just not ready for yet. So if you take that and apply that like philosophical dread that leads you to suicide, but you take that in like a magical context, that's this idea of like, you don't let a profane student access to this deeper knowledge that you have to like work your way up to. And essentially when Mickey puts on this sorcerer's hat, it's like his shortcut, skipping all of that hard work that he really needed to do to like become an actual wizard. He just puts the hat on, and now he's wielding all this power and he has no idea what to do with it. And you see everything kind of ensues from there, you know, like he accidentally creates an entire universe while the wizard's away, you know, from Big Bang all the way to paganism being stamped out by Christianity and Ave Maria. Like the whole entire thing, like humanity starts and flourishes all in the course of Mickey trying to skirt his responsibility to clean up the kitchen.
I've been told the most important things when approaching some sort of situation like this is focus and intention. Focus and intention. He has no focus because he's taking a nap, and his intentions are like stupid. So he's screwed up in both respects. But
Yeah,
then we have
exactly.
all the segments where if the world he creates at the end, that could be the rest of the Fantasia, as you mentioned. It goes, Mickey creates the Big Bang, and that world has no problem on its own. It has interesting things, but in Mickey's world, he screwed up.
And we didn't talk about movies outside of Fantasia, but there's another reoccurring theme in a lot of these movies. Pinocchio is another big one, but in Fantasia specifically, you can consider Mickey as this Gnostic concept of not God, but the Demiurge, which is this flawed God, which, so like the actual God is somewhere out there, and the actual ineffable, infallible God created a sort of like sub-God, and this is the Demiurge. And the Demiurge then created our reality and our world. And the explanation here is that our world and humanity are filled with flaws because the God that created us is also a flawed God. It's not like the biblical God, it's this Demiurge. So again, in Fantasia, you can almost look at like Yen Sid as the actual God, and as Mickey, this apprentice that kind of like wandered in and, you know, almost like someone turned on the fire hose and he had no idea what to do with it. And it just kind of like flies all over the place. He's this Demiurge that created this flawed Earth, and that's sort of this entire story that takes place over Fantasia. But again, wrapping it back to this overarching theory that the movie in itself de facto actually created and sustained the Disney universe as we know it today. Like if that movie didn't exist, maybe Disney would still be as it is today. But if you look at it as this was the main catalyst for saying, I don't want to just start making movies and repurposing grim fairy tales and selling them to movie theaters. I want to like create IP, and this whole entire concept of, you know, when you come and see a Disney movie, you leave all of your beliefs and your logic at the door and you enter like a brand new universe. So that fulfilling, you know, that actually happens through this movie and everything that comes after it.
Another actually still Disney movie. I just did a podcast about Tron, And this didn't even come up until like the last 5 minutes of our podcast, I think. But we're like, yeah, well, once the lady version, what's her name, Yori, realizes that Jeff Bridges' character is a user and actually created the program, she wants to start asking him like philosophical questions. You know, what does it all mean?
Yeah.
And he's like, I made the program to because I want to make a game.
And again, he's in that case, he's the demiurge. You know, he's the flawed god that created a flawed production, but they see him as the ultimate god.
Now, an interesting thing in there is that the villain, though, is the NPC. It's not Flynn. Flynn would be the creator in this case. He created the game, but the the evil source is not actually the demiurge in that case.
Well, the evil, it would just be like any other, because even Gnosticism has so many ties to kind of like modern Christianity. So again, this concept of evil and Satan, really it's derived not from an adversary, but the lack of whatever inspired, God. So it's just the lack of God. It's the being without that. So if the Demiurge was kind of the programmer that created this whole world, the NPC is just something that exists outside of the programmer's input. So it doesn't have to be adversarial necessarily. It's just something that lacks that sort of human ingenuity, that divine spark, I guess, that allowed the human to then create something in the human's image. Because the NPC can't create something in its image.
A couple more things. Just where is Mickey creating this? I wrote Mickey is now painting in the astral, suggesting that he would create the world of Fantasia on the astral. Although that could just be another dimension of reality as well.
That's a great question. Honestly, you made a good point before that that Mickey's doing all this almost without intention. His intention is, I want to clean up the quickest way possible without doing it myself. So I don't know. I think what results is not necessarily something that Mickey ever intends to have as a result.
One other thing I found just with lucid dreaming or really profound meditational experiences or things, they tend to happen when I'm not being creative. When I'm making music and I'm, doing a ton of podcasts and all that sort of stuff, maybe I'm writing, I tend not to have those experiences. It's kind of when I'm like, nothing's really going on. That's when it's like you have
that's
to
kind of the point, isn't it? Because
yeah,
I mean, I sort of taught myself how to meditate before I knew what it was, but before like I heard the concept. And to me, I realized at one point that if I closed my eyes, I wasn't seeing black or darkness. It was just a lack of vision. And once like it's such a hard thing to describe, but once that concept like clicked, and it's like I'm not seeing something, I'm not seeing nothing. It's just like the lack of seeing anything that can just set me directly into like a meditative state almost. And
yeah,
again,
right.
I think that's because it's almost like you're just emptying your mind so that you're not trying to think of colors, you're not trying to put forms or categorize things. As humans, we're like cursed with just constantly trying to categorize everything that comes across us. So the second you can turn that off, I think it's almost like a prerequisite. And I don't know how you could work on music or art and not be categorizing the things that you're doing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you have to take it that way. But I like to make music that would inspire that kind of experience. That's the weird thing. I don't know if you know the band Spaceman 3, but they have the album, was it music to make music to take drugs to or something? Making music to make music to take drugs to is the name of the album, right? But you can't really like take drugs and make the music, can you? I mean, you can, but you got to sober up and like work on it at some point. So maybe that's it. You got to sober up and work on it at some point. So
at least for the mastering, maybe not for anything else. Composition, everything's up in the air.
Making music to meditate to, but you can't meditate when you're making the music. I don't know, something like that. So which brings us back to the actual sorcerer as well. I mean, we don't really know what stage, if he's in a creative stage or in a passive stage, which I think is important for magical things. What kind of
there's such a really cool talk by, I think it's Alan Moore, and he's got this great concept of how artwork and creating music and art is synonymous with magic. You're essentially you're creating something out of nothing, and even if that something is the result of all sorts of influences and other art and other music that you've heard, the fact that you can just kind of sit down without anything going on and produce something that wasn't there before, that's almost an exact definition of magic. You sit down with the will and the intent and you create something from nothing, essentially. I mean, how is that not magic?
Yeah. So I guess in the end, Fantasia is a bit of an egregore that has been lasting for 50 years plus.
I mean, I think there's a very, very strong case, especially if you look at how powerful Disney has become over the years. Now, obviously, there's business acumen and
Mm.
all sorts of like strategy involved in that. It wasn't just that a bunch of pagans got together and made a silly movie in the 40s, and they're just like reaping the benefits of the magic that they put out into the world. But I mean, Fantasia is so ingrained in Disney DNA. Even if it's not the most popular thing that they've put out, it is the most sort of like comprehensive and far-reaching for that time. Like at no other point had Disney put something out in aggregate that was such a big risk. You know what I mean? Like Fantasia wasn't based on a best-selling book like the Brothers Grimm, which was only outsold by the Bible for hundreds of years. So it's very hard to kind of compare the two.
Well, I guess I need to be wrapping up today just to let you know I have a train to catch eventually. But
Okay,
Thomas,
yeah.
if you could
Get
tell
to work,
people,
man.
yeah, if you could tell people a little bit about where to find you and what you're up to.
Oh yeah, thanks. So I've got a website called paranoidamerican.com. That's pretty much the best way to find out what I'm up to. I'm on Instagram. It's the only social media I use. It's also at Paranoid American. And like you mentioned in the beginning of the show, I've been working ever since I was at Disney. I was um, got to work with all sorts of world-class artists and animators. And while I was there, I was like, hey, I want to start working on something of my own, even if I can't draw. So I'd have them sketch some things out for me over lunch or whatever. And eventually that turned into publishing my own written comics for over 10 years now. So if you go to paranoidamerican.com, you can see a large selection of all different comics that I've been writing.
Yeah, I haven't read them yet, but I did see there's one about faking the moon landings with Kubrick. I'm like, oh, I got to read that.
That one's called Never a Straight Answer, which stands for NASA. And yeah, it's about Stanley Kubrick shooting the moon landing, although it takes the fact that he faked the moon landings as such a matter of fact. So the comic really is like that's happening in the background, and the actual things happening to Stanley are just like him being frustrated with the red tape of government, and he wants to get this big budget, and we have to go to Antarctica and get this exact meteorite for this scene because this is the closest one that would look like on the moon's surface, and getting pushback from generals and the CIA and stuff. So it's almost like an office water cooler comedy, like mundane things happening in a really crazy environment.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to check that one out. As for this podcast, it's Aural Hygiene. We're at Twitter at Aural Hygiene Pod, Facebook, a little more socials than you have, I guess. I also talk about sci-fi movies at Matt and Luke's Sci-Fi Sanctuary, The Twilight Zone at Time Enough Podcast, and you can find this all at Patreon under the umbrella of Podcastio Podcastius. So, okay, Thomas,
It does sound like a magic spell you just cast right then.
It is. I finally got good doing it. My Luke, my co-host, he just got in a rant where he would do it, right? He was like, I hate myself every time I do this. And now that I've been doing more of my solo podcasting, I have to do it too. So yeah, I just kind of trance out and say it. I was like not even paying attention when I was saying it's in truth. So yes, it is a bit of a spell. I hope I cast the spell so people will go listen to some podcasts. Okay, we'll go wish upon some stars.